Thank you so much, Marion, for that introduction. In a way, I feel I should probably leave now while the going's good. All I can do, I feel I can only fall from the pedestal. Before I start, I'd very much like to thank Sue and Rachel for organising this event. It's a great honour for me to speak to you all, and mostly to thank you all for coming. When I came to Australia, I thought I'd get a bit of warmth, but I will get the warmth from the company rather than from the weather. The talk I'm going to give really sort of centres on this exhibition that's currently being staged, which is really 20 years of my graphic work. And this exhibition sort of starts with work which was, purely analogue, etching, and evolves through my engagement with the computer and out the other end. What I also want to sort of try and put across is the relationship of my print work to my sculpture. I've always considered that, on my tombstone, I'd quite like to have artist that did all these different things. I tend to sort of follow my inclination as to what medium I use as the best means possible to express an idea. Some of those get explored through sculptures, some through prints, some through drawings, but there is a kind of continuous interaction and flow. But one thing that I would like to make sort of very clear is that for me, my print work is never a secondary activity. I'm not an artist that does something and also makes prints on the cheap to sell. For me, if I have a print in a collection, that is just as important to me as if a sculpture is there, and that each print has to sort of embody an idea and sort of go out in the world as an independent artwork. This is just a couple of shots of the opening. The show consists of over 50 prints, 3 bookworks and 3 sculptures. And here you can see the kind of the idea was to begin to sort of suggest that relationship between the sculptures and the prints. Now, I want to start with this, which is a drawing. And this was made around about 20 years ago. And it was on the occasion when my wife Charlotte and I were both invited to do a residency in Madrid. I don't know if you find it as artists, but sometimes you can find that your practice has got a bit muddled and complicated. And I used this opportunity to strip down my language and my tools and everything. And I took a little box of drawing materials, scalpels, rubber, some glue, and some paper. And for the next 2 months, all I did was draw. Once you've gone through the pain barrier, some interesting things started to emerge. Well, they were interesting for me. This drawing is about 60 by 40. The background is actually printed with potato cut, making a little sort of motif which was then stamped into ink and stamped over. And into this are sort of objects that are sort of, in a way I imagine them almost like being woven. And what I was trying to do was to suggest, and in a way this is a kind of reoccurring idea, that a kind of leitmotif that will run through most of the work I show you, is that in some ways I'd like to sort of to show some aspect of the way that a life is composed of a range of things that are held together in a kind of tension. You can have the best car in the world, but if your battery's dead, it's not going to get you anywhere. And so in a way, all our lives are only as good as the weakest bit. And there's also shifting sands by which, at different moments, different things take on very, very different degrees of importance. I give you an example that I'm sure all of you have sort of gone from 0 to 100 to a state of apoplexy because you can't find your keys. And suddenly, amongst all your worldly possessions, this little bit of metal is the only thing that you care about, and you would kill to find it. then hopefully your life settles down, and then it just becomes another item that accompanies you in your journey. Now, another thing is that you won't see any figures in my work. For the most part, I'm trying to sort of represent the figure through the association of objects and things like this. Now, the nearest I get is the jacket, which in a way, I suppose, is standing in for the presence of the figure. And I wanted to sort of weave these other elements into it, as if suggesting that this was the kind of composite of a life and the kind of ingredients that could make up something that was fairly balanced. And this was a sculpture from a similar kind of time. And in this sculpture, I tried to imagine what it would be like to arrive in a place afresh. What would you need to establish yourself? Well, you need a chair. You know, we have an expression, take a seat. You know, you were all invited to take a seat to listen to me. And that's an indication that you're going to stay and engage, that you're not just on your way out, hopefully. You know, keep the doors locked at the back. You also need to work in order to live. And so there's a spade here that I hope represents some element of, you know, man's relationship to tools. But also, we're as human beings, we're beyond. There's something else beyond that, and we understand ourselves through where we've come from, through our past, through our ancestors, through our loved ones, and so the picture frame is meant to suggest that kind of relationship. And this piece is about 4 or 5 foot high. I wanted them to suggest sort of in a way like cages or sort of something that would have contained an object. These ideas are then explored in these etchings. There was a series of 4 etchings, and I'll show you 2, called chairs. And these are very, very simple. I mean, unfortunately, you're not going to learn much about anything sort of neat and tricky about printmaking, because I tend to go from A to B as quickly as possible. So, you know, this print is very simply just hard ground and aquatint. And here, you know, the chair has become a stand-in for the jacket. And you can see sort of elements of things that I would associate with a life being led. You know, there's a house which might suggest security, I don't know. There's a suitcase which might suggest travel. There's a violin that might suggest music or culture. There's a boat which might suggest travel, and there's a bouquet of flowers because without romance we're dead. And each of these is sort of stamped in with a fingerprint as a kind of mark of identity. And here there's another print from that series. Here the fingerprint has become almost like a net in which these things are held. You know, I suppose it's sort of my way of thinking about things like DNA and things like that, and in a way what our identity consists of and what it contains. Can you all hear me, by the way? Oh, good, okay. Now, at this point, this is about 1993, 94, I started to use the computer for the first time. Now, it's very easy to forget how primitive the early computers, desktop computers were that we had. The computer that I worked on with these had a monitor that was about this sort of size, and had a very small memory, so that after each line you drew, you had to save it, otherwise you would lose it, it would crash. And there was also a delay in drawing the line and seeing the line on the monitor. So it was a slightly disembodied experience. And the technician that was trying to sort of teach me how to use the computer, a guy called George Whale, kept sort of showing me more and more things, and I was getting very confused. And I said, look, all I need to know is how can I make a line go, you know, forward and backwards, and how can I get rid of it? And let's start with that. Now, one of the things that I did take to immediately was, and this sounds kind of odd, but the clumsiness and awkwardness of drawing with a mouse. And I still only draw with the mouse with the computer. And I like the way that one grabs it in almost like a claw-like way and moves it around in a way which is very, very distinct from a pencil or a pen. So when I'm using the mouse, I'm not thinking of a pencil, I'm thinking of a mouse. I'm not trying to imitate something. If I want to use a pencil, I use a pencil. Working with the mouse is a very different sort of physical thing. But anyway, to cut a long story short, the other problems at this stage with the computer was in terms of output, that the inks on the were dye-based and therefore literally faded as you were looking at them. If you had an exhibition and you put them up, by the time you took it down, there was a lot less to see. So it wasn't really very satisfactory. And also the range of papers was very limited that you could use. And it tended to sort of either be a very high gloss photo paper or else something like, a really manky cartridge. But as I said, I did really enjoy the act of drawing, and what it also meant I could do was begin to work on layers and edit out all my mistakes, so that then when I made the print, you didn't have all that trail of corrections and things like that. So this was drawn and then turned into a photo etching, and then etched in a kind of conventional way. And this is another print from that series, and in this case, the plate was very, very deeply etched and then surface rolled as if it was a lino cut. These prints are very much about sort of creating a layering of depth. And I wanted to sort of try working with an extended series so that a series could be read as a kind of like a linear narrative. And so this is a series of photolithos in line block. So they're four-colour litho, and then the black dot that you can see is embossed and printed down relief onto the print. The series is called Means of Escape, and I wanted to sort of set up a very simple scenario of taking a journey. So if you're taking a journey, you need an alarm clock to get up, you need a glass of water, and you need a postcard or something, a destination of where you're going to. You need a bag to put your things in. You need a means of transport, so here's a plane. This was made from a photograph of a toy plane dangling from a piece of wire in my studio, that I then took photographs of the floor of the studio, juxtaposed the two together, and then drew the shadow. So it was all a bit more complicated than it looks. There's another form of transport. If you're taking a journey, you need to iron your clothes so you look your best, and you need to pack up your belongings. And then this is either when you've arrived, you've taken off your coat, or this is what you've forgotten and you've left behind. Now, one of the things that I tried to do in this series was to also start to play with the halftone dot, which has become a bit of an obsession with me. The halftone dot, as a lot of you printmakers will know, is really one of the most fundamental ways that a photograph can enter into the language of printmaking, that we put it through a halftone dot in order to print it, and hence how press photographs have that sort of very particular quality. But what I also wanted to do was to play with the dot as a kind of graphic device. So these dots have been dramatically reworked dot by dot on the computer. It seems a bit mad, really, but it means that I can sort of shape that surface so the halftone both refers to what is below, but also begins to have an independent life. Now, I took that idea a little bit further in this series of prints called Constellations, and here I sort of started to take the dot layer, and I started to think, well, when you look up at the night sky and you see all the stars, by beginning to join those up, our ancestors sort of came up with Orion's belt or the plough or things like that. But I thought that, for us, we might come up with the constellation of the coat hanger, for example, or the open suitcase. What they're also an invitation to do is to play with the imagination. They also reference those children's games of dot to dot, whereby which you can construct a drawing by following lines and things like this. And these are put across as kind of like propositions. I mean, in some ways, I would almost like you to think that you could come up with your own. Now, if you see the objects in the print, these objects were from a sculpture of mine that was then photographed and then became the basis of this print. And this is another set of sculptures called Family Group, which begin to sort of show the way that I work. One of the other aspects of my practice has been my writing and curatorial work. And the artist Giorgio Morandi, and here this a wonderful etching from the British Museum, has been a kind of great obsession of mine. In a way, I suppose one of the things is that, like myself, Morandi rarely used the figure and really tried to sort of articulate the world through the use of objects and our relationship with objects. But also, in a way, Morandi's cross-hatching, I felt, was beginning to be quite akin to my use of the half-tone dot. So there were a lot of kind of crossovers. But anyway, I also had the sense that Morandi occupied a very particular place in English art history and seemed to be someone that was an artist's artist and seemed to have influenced, a whole range of artists. So I put forward a proposition to the Estrick collection of contemporary Italian art in London to ask if I could curate an exhibition around this idea of Morandi's influence on British art. And I was successful in also getting funding from the Art and Humanities Research Council, and also the book publishers, Philip Wilson, agreed to publish the book. And so over a period of a year, 18 months, I explored Morandi's influence on British art, looking at ideas about the Reformation and the English love for reduction and minimalism. And what I did was I staged an exhibition by which there were about 13 or 14 British artists, starting with Ben Nicholson and working up to Michael Craig Martin. And I juxtaposed a key work by Morandi with a key work by a particular artist to set up a kind of conversation. I know that there are some curators in the room. I'm not a kind of curator. I'm an artist who tried to do a bit of curating. And so I felt that what I had to do was privy the thing that I think artists do best, which is the act of looking and scrutinizing, and that's the way we learn. So, for example, this is one juxtaposition. This is once again the Morandi. This is one of my prints on the right, and I wanted to set up a dialogue. And this, which I thought was a very striking juxtaposition, here is a key late painting by Morandi that we borrowed from the Museum of Modern Art in Edinburgh. And on the right is a painting by Michael Craig Martin that he did especially for the exhibition. Now, to give you an idea of some of the things I tried to tease out, obviously there's one kind of obvious visual kind of connection between Morandi and Michael Craig Martin in both their engagement in everyday objects. But there was also something about the kind of methodology of Morandi and Craig Martin, which was, for me, very striking. Morandi would go round gathering bottles, bric-a-brac and things like that, which we'd then take up into his studio and lay around the floor or on shelves. These he would then sort of gradually, as fancy took him, take them out and begin to make arrangements. And then they would move around, and then finally he would paint or draw from them. Now, Craig Martin had a very similar methodology, but his was totally within his computer. He has a bank of about 350 drawings of generic objects, which he's done over the last 20 years. And what he does is he plucks these out and continually rearranges them. So here are two artists that are separated by some 50 years between these two works, and one in an analogue age and one in a digital. But there's a very common sense of their thinking. And this was the book, which is still available on Amazon, I think. Now, going back to to my own work, this is a set of collotypes that I made with Paul Coldwell at UWE in Bristol. And here I was sort of trying to use the objects to puncture something about the bombing of Baghdad that was going on at the time. Our politicians were feeding us the line that the bombing of Baghdad was so intelligent that bombs were only sort of destroying strategic targets. And there was no mention of any casualties. Now, one only has to sort of think of the huge tonnage that was dropped on Baghdad to understand that thousands of people, innocent people, were killed. And so this set of three was just a way of trying to suggest that underneath the bombing there is some kind of human presence that's been affected. So here's a twisted pair of glasses and a coat hanger. So in some ways these become kind of like metaphors for the presence of people. And this sense of suggesting the presence is also evidence in this digital print, mine called Barrier. And here, I mean, one of the things I'm very interested in is, as you've probably already noticed, I'm not in this expressionistic mode of art. I tend to sort of try and hold back. And one of my intentions is to try and construct images that hover on a kind of tipping point where you, the viewer, has to take this either into optimism or pessimism. I mean, here, my intention was to construct an image that hovered between commemoration and memorial. Mountains, historically, have often been, both political and geographical barriers, and they are places where, refugees have often had to risk going over the mountains rather than across borders. But also, mountains are a place where we go to play, to experience the sublime, and to, get a new perspective on ourselves. So I wanted these flowers, which take their colour from the picture behind, to almost sort of suggest that sense of, is this a commemoration or is this a celebration? This is a bookwork that I made with a dear friend of mine called Tony Rudolph, entitled Kafka's Doll. Now, I'll give you a very brief synopsis of the story. Tony wrote a story based on a real-life occurrence in Franz Kafka's life. Very briefly, Kafka is walking in the park in Berlin, comes across a little girl who's crying because her doll is lost. And Kafka, on the spur of the moment, says, well, I know where your doll is, your doll will write to you. And then Kafka then proceeds to write to the doll and they establish a correspondence over years. And then Kafka also has to get out of the situation as well. Now also, because it's Kafka, it's a little bit more complicated. The little girl is called Dora, the doll is called Dora, and Kafka's girlfriend is called Dora. So it's Dora, Dora, Dora. And these things move in between each other. So this is the doll lost in the park. There's one bit in the story where Kafka is warning Dora that she will have to leave Berlin fairly soon because of, the inference is because of the rise of Nazism. So this is a sort of an oblique reference to Kristallnacht. And here is the bundle of letters that has been kept by Dora. And returning to the idea of my drawing with the mouse, this is the letters are all drawn with the mouse, and it has a unified line, which also stops me from slipping into something more expressive. Whenever I do that, and lots of people do that very well, when I do it, it looks silly and self-indulgent. And so I kind of keep a tight rein on that. But this kind of restrained drawing, I think you'll also see in a sculpture like this, which is a sculpture of an iron, where really it's like a linear three-dimensional drawing around an object. It's both kind of object and a skeleton. And then you can see that kind of drawing in these three silk screens, sets of memory. And here, once again, I wanted to set up a juxtaposition between the drawing and the photographic background. So here there's a suitcase and mountains. Here is a book and a railway track. And, once again, I would like them to be sort of slightly ambivalent. Is this holiday reading on your trip to the beach, or is this something, more sinister? In 2008, I had the kind of invitation that one often sort of dreams of, and it was from the curator at Kettle's Yard in Cambridge, Michael Harrison, and he invited me to make some work for the house at Kettle's Yard. For those of you that aren't aware of this place, Kettle's Yard was a house that was owned by Jim Eade, who was one of the curators at the Tate in the 1950s. And he was a great supporter of English modernism, but also had a passionate belief in the idea of the relationship of art and life. And so the house is full of juxtapositions and very clearly cited artworks and objects. And under every object is a little red dot, so it can't be moved. And there are seats which privy different views. And it's one of the few galleries where you were invited to actually sit on the seats and things like this. And I spent about a year visiting the museum, the house, testing things out, making work. And so this is Jim Eade's bed, and underneath is a line from The Poetics of Space by Gaston Bachelard. This house shelters daydreaming, and in some ways that kind of began to kind of set up the relationship I wanted to have. This is another small bronze where the house itself is on a table as if it's being scrutinized, as if it's being examined and thought about what a house might be. Here's another one where the house is open to reveal the attic and the basement and a kind of free flow of ideas. Bachelard talks very eloquently about the different spaces in a house. I was trying to allude to that. One of the things that I tried to do in the house was bring back some of the things that were edited out. Because for all the elegance of the house and the relationships in it, a lot of things were absent. There was no evidence of a family having lived there, and there was no evidence of the kind of rubbish that most of us surround our lives with, the cleaning, the toilet duck and things like that. So this is a little model sailing boat on a rubber cast of a record with his master's voice to suggest some kind of sense of play. These are picture frames suggesting the kind of family that might have been there. And this gives you an idea of one of the juxtapositions I did. This is the piano at Kettlejard, and on it is a beautiful Brancusi, the head of Prometheus. Now, in most houses I've ever been in, if there's a piano, it's covered in photographs of the family and things like this. And I thought that this was really symbolic of the way that this house had been stripped down to be presented as an aesthetic experience rather than something lived in. This is just to show I can draw. These are my sketchbook drawings, that I do all the time, and they're really just to stop me forgetting. I draw them over and over again, and eventually I have to do something with them. So I then got these picture frames cast in glass, and they were cast in such a way that there were little air bubbles trapped in them, so it felt as if they were breathing. And then these picture frames then surrounded the head, and I wanted to set up this relationship between the density of the solid bronze head of Brancusi and the transparency and the ethereal quality of the picture frames. This is a drawing that I show my students as an indication that even the smallest thing can sometimes be of value. Now this is in a sketchbook that size, so this drawing is about 5 centimetres, if that. And it was just a thought. It had ended up with a hot water bottle made in bronze on Jim Eade's wife's bed. They both had very simple, single monastic beds, and I thought that Jim Eade's wife was probably a little bit lonely, a little bit cold, and needed warming up. But I also wanted the sculpture to almost reference the ribs and things like that. And then finally some other little bronzes where I sort of tried to reintroduce some of the day-to-day flotsam. So here's a milk bottle and a toilet duck, and here's a set of everyday objects that one imagined had been edited out. And then these ideas once again come back into printmaking in these large digital prints, where I tried to imagine a kind of imagined portrait of Jim without drawing Jim. So these are some of the objects that I associate with him. Now, one of the things that I try to do in my work is engage you, the viewer, in the act of looking. In some ways, you have to disregard the drawing in order to read the photograph, and vice versa. And so in a way, my hope is that these ideas are then stored in your brain and you put them together again in your head. This is not a scientific theory, but it's a hope. And here's objects from Jim Eade's bathroom, where I imagined him preparing himself. These objects, these are then sort of reinterpreted in this laser cut print that's then been printed relief in conjunction with liner cut. And once again it's sort of setting up a relationship between the photographic language and the drawn language, and one bouncing off the other. In some ways I wanted these to almost like be little lost elements that you kind of begin to sort of bring together in your mind. Here's another one. Sort of, the wishbone sort of hovers somewhere between a ring, a cameo brooch and a key, and you have to make your own mind up what that's all about. Those ideas go once again back into sculpture. This is a sculpture called What Remains, where this is about this high. And here, I'm trying to sort of suggest the interconnectivity of things. Michael Harrison, I think very kindly, but probably shows my dark side, said that I was the kind of person that would be interested in house clearance after all the good stuff's gone. And I thought that was very perceptive, because the kind of objects I'm interested in my work are the kind of objects that have very little value. They are the kind of objects that get sort of left in the cupboard and things like that when you go and all the rest of it. But they are probably the things that you've had the most intimate relationship with throughout your life. That your comb probably contains your DNA. The flower from a romantic encounter that you've kept. Your toothbrush, which you've used, until it's worn out. I mean, I like these objects where we have a physical relationship with them, and their value to us far exceeds their financial cost. And they're the kind of objects that when we really value them when we haven't got them. When you fly long haul and you don't have a toothbrush, you know the value of a toothbrush. These ideas are also explored in drawing. Now, I mean, this drawing is essentially one line. A lot of my work involves a kind of sense of play. The great French artist Francis Picabia was asked what was the most important question an artist could ask. And he simply said, I wonder what will happen if I do this. And this drawing is really about that. I drew the objects, and then I set a line in motion. And I must say, I love watching snooker. Snooker is all about angles, and the way that the ball hits the cushion and goes off at the opposite angle and keeps going. So this drawing was one line that was set in motion, with the rule that when it hit an object, it would go off at an opposite angle, and then when it got to the edge of the paper, it would go back in again. And in a way, it was to see how that kind of proposition could join all these objects, all these objects up in some way, to almost like mesh them together. And here's another one that was done much more freehand in a kind of, floppy way, really. And those ideas, once again, get taken through into printmaking. This is a set of laser cut that then printed, very simply printed relief. These are 2 blocks. So there's the drawing, and I think you can just about perceive a kind of cloth that's been suspended, almost like the shroud of Veronica or something like that. Here's another. So in a way, the drawing quite playfully picks up on rhythms from the photograph behind, but also adds something else. I was very pleased to be invited by the National Glass Centre in Sunderland to make some work, and so these ideas got taken into glass. These are made in clear Pyrex glass, and once again it is about sort of joining up, almost like doing an underground map, but instead of stations there are objects. So I almost kind of think, I'm trying to map the human heart in some kind of obscure way. And this is another one. There are also wonderful chance things that happen. This was the first time I'd worked in glass, and I was amazed that when the work was exhibited, what one really saw was the shadow, and the shadow was more substantial than the glass itself, which actually fitted in with my long-term interest with an artist like Marcel Duchamp, where he talks about his large glass as a delay in glass, and a lot of his work actually, a lot of the ready-mades and things like this existed in order to cast shadows. This then goes into a set of silk screens. And some of these become quite difficult to look at. I don't really want to give the viewer too easy a ride. I want them to have some kind of effect. And also for you, when you see these in the flesh, you actually have to find a proper viewing distance. And I quite like the way of engaging the audience in that kind of way. This is a silkscreen wood block. And these are two very recent, well, this is a very recent print I've just printed with the Edinburgh Print Workshop. And then, just finally, this is a new set of digital prints and relief print. So the bouquet is lino cut, and the background is digital. And I had an invitation from a Japanese paper company to make some work. They selected 5 artists from Japan and 5 artists from across Europe to be commissioned to make some work on their new Japanese paper that had been specially formulated for inkjet. And this paper is just a dream. It costs a bomb, but it's a dream. There's a way that the ink is absorbed to the paper that made me want to sort of change the way I was working a little bit more. And so these respond to the paper and the colour of the paper and that kind of absorbency, but also in a way, by printing relief onto them, I also want to set up and jar that uniformity that you can get with inkjet. I'm becoming increasingly tired of the uniformity of the purely digital inkjet print, and I want to sort of combine it with other processes in order to bring out its own quality without it being just total saturation. So this is set of 4. This is just the final one. I'm just in the process of staging an exhibition at the Scott Polar Research Institute in Cambridge, where for the last year I've been rifling through their archives. And in a way, it's right up my street. It's all the little objects and things like that they took to the pole. And these are, this is one of the pieces I've made, which is 5 objects pointing south. So each object has its own compass, so you can point it in the right direction. And these are a kind of family of objects which are about sharing and exchange, but also, I would hope, about something a little bit claustrophobic. So these are some of the exhibitions that are coming up. This is some of the writing that I've got out at the moment. That's the book I wrote 2 years ago, which is still available, I think. And I'd just like to thank Sue, Rachel, and Marion. Thank you very much.